For today's video demonstration, I'm going to be making drop biscuits and gravy. And before I begin, I'm going to go ahead and measure out all of my ingredients, make sure I have all the equipment I need, so that way I have mise en place before I start. So first, for the biscuits, I'm going to need 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour just refers to what you might think of as regular white flour. So if you will remember, flour is something that gets compacted if you smush it down. So we're going to want to use a spoon to spoon our flour in, and then we'll go ahead, once it's overflowing, we will level it off. We don't want the flour to compact because we don't want to make our biscuits tough and dry with excess flour. My jar is not quite big enough for that, so I did make a decent mess on my counter. So I have 1 cup of all-purpose flour, and to that I'm going to add a 1/2 cup. So I'm going to just do the same thing and measure a 1/2 cup. Fill it to overflowing, and then level it off. I'm just moving it back and forth to make sure all of the little holes get filled in, and so it's a nice level cup, 1/2 cup of flour. All right, my next ingredient is 2 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. I have a little bowl that I'm going to measure it into. It's important to note that we are using a teaspoon, not a tablespoon. 3 teaspoons equals 1 tablespoon. So want to make sure that you're using the right equipment when you're measuring. So I'm going to use teaspoons, not tablespoon, and I'm doing 2 1/4. Baking powder is great because it's got a little built-in flat surface there, so I don't even have to use my leveler. I can just level it off in the container. So that's 2 teaspoons plus a 1/4 teaspoon. Next up, I'm going to need 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. And so I use this as my salt, and this is what I use to cook with. So I'm just going to fill it to overflowing and level it off. You can just use whatever salt you have, table salt, kosher salt, whatever you have is fine. 3/4 of a cup of milk for the biscuits. We are going to use a separate measurement of milk and flour and salt for the gravy as well. So it's just important that you keep the ingredients separate. So for my 3/4 of a cup of milk, I'm going to use a liquid measuring cup. I have my milk here. I'm going to squat down at eye level and pour until I get 3/4 of a cup. I over poured just slightly. So pour a little bit back in. And there I have 3/4 of a cup. And then the last ingredient I'm going to need for the biscuits is 2 tablespoons of butter or margarine. I'm going to use butter. As you'll see on a stick of butter, it has the tablespoon markings on it. So I'm just going to cut off 2 tablespoons of butter and put that in a separate prep bowl, and that's what I will use to microwave it here in a little bit. All right, so now I need to measure out the ingredients for my gravy. 1/2 pound of bulk pork or turkey sausage. So you're looking for a breakfast sausage here. I just got traditional turkey sausage, and so it says 1/2 pound. This is 14 ounces, which is just slightly under a pound. Honestly, if you like sausage, you can just use the whole thing and double the gravy ingredients. I am going to stick to the recipe, and so even though it's about 2 ounces short, I'm just going to cut it in half straight through the casing, and that's what I'll use to cook. Okay, the rest of our ingredients are 3 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. So for this, I do want to use the tablespoon measuring spoon. Again, it's 3 times the size of a teaspoon. So you want to just make sure that you're using the proper measuring. If I only did this much flour, it wouldn't be enough. So tablespoons, and I'm going to measure that into a separate prep bowl. Because it's just a small amount, you are just going to scoop and level. And so I'm just going to scoop and level and do that 3 times. This flour is going to be used to make what's called a roux, which is a French term. You are combining flour with fat to make a thickener for the milk. So instead of using heavy cream, we're just going to be using regular milk and the flour mixed with the fat, and that's going to come from the pork or turkey sausage. As it cooks, it will render some fat. So we're going to mix the flour into that. It will help thicken the milk without having to use like heavy cream. 1.5 cups of milk. I have a separate measuring cup here, so I'm going to measure 1.5 cups of milk. And then my last 2 ingredients are a 1/4 teaspoon of salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. So I'm going to grab another prep bowl. All right, so I looked ahead to see that these ingredients could be combined. So I have 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I'm going to mix in with that 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. Here I just have plain black pepper. If you have the shaker or grinder, you'll just need to measure out 1/2 teaspoon. All right, so now I have all of the ingredients that I need. So we're gonna start going through the recipe to make sure that we have all the equipment we need. So for the biscuits, in a bowl, I'm gonna combine the flour, which I've already done, with the baking soda and salt, combine milk and melted butter, stir it into the dry ingredients, so that will be separate. Drop by rounded spoonfuls. So I have some spoons here that I'm going to use to do that. Onto a baking sheet. I have that out as well. And bake at 450 degrees. And then for the gravy, I'm going to do that in a saucepan. So for this, you're using a saucepan. So that's a pan that has high sides to it. It doesn't have to be this big, it can be smaller. But you want to use a saucepan instead of a saute pan, because we're actually adding in quite a lot of milk. And if you try to do that in a saute pan, you're gonna have a really hard time mixing it. So you wanna do it in a saucepan that has sides to it, to make sure that you don't spill as you're mixing it. So we're gonna cook the sausage, sprinkle the flour, stir in the milk, salt and pepper, keep stirring it, and then serve over biscuits. So back here, I have a wooden spoon and a whisk to help me with those steps as well. And now I'm ready to go ahead and get started. First up, I'm gonna go ahead and mix together the ingredients for my biscuits and get those into the oven while I make the gravy. So it says to combine the flour, so I already have that here, baking soda, and salt. I'm just gonna use the rubber spatula that I'll use throughout the mixing process to mix that up. Then it says to combine the milk and melted butter. And so I have my melted butter off, or my butter off to the side, so I'm gonna need to go ahead and melt that. In the ingredients, it says melted for 10 seconds in the microwave because you don't want it to overcook. It won't take very long to melt the butter. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay, I have my melted butter. I have a fairly small microwave, and so it did take a little bit longer than mine at 10 seconds to mostly melt. I do still have a chunk of butter in here, but because most of it is melted, once I just stir it around a little bit, you can see that that little chunk will melt as well. And so I'm going to mix that into my 3/4 of a cup of milk. It's important that you make sure that you don't mix it into the milk that's intended for the gravy, which is twice as much milk. So I'm gonna mix in my butter into my milk, and I'm just gonna stir that up a little bit. And then I'm gonna stir it into my dry ingredients until just blended. As you guys have learned by now, when we are doing quick breads, so breads that use baking soda or baking powder as their leavening agent, we don't want to over mix the dough because it will become tough and dry. So if we were making like a bread dough, we would knead it a lot and mix it a lot. But anything that uses baking soda or baking powder, in general, we don't want to over mix it. We just want to stir it until it's nice and well combined. So that way it doesn't get overworked and tough. So this is a drop biscuit dough. And so from here, once I have it all nice and combined, and again, not over mixing, I'm gonna drop my rounded spoonfuls onto a greased baking sheet. And so I'm gonna wanna grab some cooking spray and spray my cookie sheet. And then I'm just going to use 2 spoons, use one to scoop and one to splice off. You really can do these any size that you want to. It just depends on how you like them. They take 10 to 12 minutes to bake. If they are smaller biscuits, like how I'm doing here, they'll take a shorter amount of time to bake. If you decide, hey, there's 4 people in my family, I just want to do 4 giant biscuits, that works, and you can do that. They will just take slightly longer to bake. You want to make sure that they're fairly even in size so that they bake evenly. So it says to bake at 450 degrees for 10 to 12 minutes. I'm going to set mine for the lesser amount of time, check them at the 10-minute mark, and if they're nice and lightly golden brown at the top, I'll know that they're done. If not, I can always put them back in. While my biscuits are baking, I'm going to go ahead and start making the gravy. So in a saucepan, I'm going to cook the sausage over medium heat until no longer pink. It does not say to add any fat, any type of oil or butter to the pan, because either turkey sausage or pork sausage should have plenty of fat in it to use to cook. You're going to want to go ahead and cook your sausage until it's no longer pink. And this is important for either turkey sausage or pork sausage or whatever sausage you're using. If you wanted a vegetarian option, you could saute some mushrooms in a little bit of olive oil, and that makes a really nice gravy as well. The mushroom gravy goes great over biscuits. So as you can see here, I have cooked down the turkey sausage and it has rendered some fat. So some of it has turned into fat. So you'll see the bottom of my saucepan has some fat on it. Instead of adding oil or butter to this, I'm going to just use that fat that's on the bottom there to make my roux. And so a roux is a flour and fat mixture. What that does is it will thicken our milk when we go to cook it, so we don't have to use a heavy cream, which would make this recipe taste even heartier and have a higher fat content than most people would want. So I want to just cook that and stir it until the flour is almost mixed in, and then I'm going to gradually stir in my milk. And I'm gonna add a little bit at a time and kind of scrape up the bits on the bottom that might be stuck on the bottom of the saute pan so those don't start burning. I'm gonna also add in my salt and pepper. Stir that up. I'm gonna turn my heat up to medium-high because in order for the roux to work with the milk will actually need to boil. Here's the thing though, is once it starts boiling, it's very close to starting to burn on the bottom of the pan. So I'm gonna just watch it very carefully, and once it comes to a boil, I'm gonna turn the heat down to medium and cook until it has thickened. Once it starts boiling around the edges, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it down and keep stirring it as it thickens to make sure that I'm not burning anything along the bottom. As you can see, as I kind of pull away from the sides, I can see that and feel that nothing is sticking to the bottom, and that's what I want. I don't want it to start burning on the bottom. So I have my gravy right here. I've got my biscuits. You'll see that they just start to turn lightly golden brown on the top, but really what you're looking for is that the bottom has turned a nice golden brown. I'm gonna put that one or two in a bowl. I'm gonna top it with my gravy. And there you have the final product of biscuits and gravy. Bon appetit!